Hi, today we're going to be going through the TSA 2016 question, should we care more about the survival of animal species or the welfare of individual animals? With these aims in mind and using our standard structure, pause the video for a refresher, let's get into it. In this question, what sort of terms do you think need a definition? Well, I'd go with survival. So are we talking about non-extinction? What about instrumental use? So are rhinos preserved in zoos? Would we call them surviving? What quality of life do these surviving species have? And what number of individuals, how many of the species survive? These are all questions we might want to consider. We'd also want to think about what welfare means. Does it mean level of pleasure? Is it a sort of aggregate? Do you add up pleasure and then take away the amount of pain and then come up with a number? Is that what welfare means? Or is it just a lack of pain? Is that what welfare means? And then the question, should we care more about, is really getting at, well, which is more important? Which is more important, survival of the species or the welfare of individual animals? Let's get into how to answer the question. So, how do we answer the question? Well, we want to answer which is more important. In order to do this, we need a moral framework to tell us, well, what actually is important. Can you think of any examples of moral frameworks you might use, which say this is something you should do or this is something you shouldn't? Well, you might want to say you shouldn't do harm, do no harm, would be one moral framework. You might say maximising happiness would be another, or maximising liberty or freedom would be another. These are all ones that you could use. Whichever one you use throughout, and I'll be using several because it's an introductory video, but whichever one you use throughout, you'll want to explain why you're using it, why you think that's the most important thing. Maybe you think do no harm perfectly meshes the balance between liberty and happiness. Maybe you think happiness outweighs the do no harm principle. You could, if you can boost happiness by doing harm to someone, that's okay, you might argue. But you'd want to argue why you think that. How then do we answer the question? Well, we do it with a survival is more important or a welfare is more important. Using the moral framework to work out what's important, can you come up with some points on either side that might say, well, survival is more important because, and welfare is more important because? On the survival side, we might say, well, in order to benefit from welfare, we need to be surviving, or the animals need to survive. Survival of species can benefit humans, and that's more important than the welfare of animals, you might argue. You might say biodiversity itself is good inherently, or you might talk about future generations of people, keeping knowledge for the future, letting your great-great-grandchildren see elephants, that sort of thing. On the side that says welfare is more important, you could say, well, why survive? Why would the animals benefit from surviving? Why is it worth it for them to survive if they're getting no welfare out of it? You might say, it's not, therefore welfare is more important. We might say we shouldn't use animals as a means to our end, so don't view animals' survival as good for humans, only animals matter. You might say, well, talking of species is distracting because what they really are is a collection of individuals, and individuals only benefit from welfare, therefore welfare is all that matters. And you might say it's morally non-arbitrary to talk about welfare because you can compare about it cross-species, whereas you might have to choose which species you let survive. We're going to take a couple of points on either side and look at them in a bit more depth. On the side that says, well, the survival of the species is what matters, we might argue, as our first point, well, welfare requires survival. Why does welfare require survival? Can you think? Well, if there are no living animals in a species, then that species isn't getting any welfare. If there's no species welfare, then there's no welfare that's relevant in this scenario. And you might say, well, therefore survival is a necessary condition. Survival is necessary for welfare. Without survival, we can't have welfare. You might ask, so what? Well, without survival we can't get survival, and without survival we can't get welfare. Therefore, we should care more about survival, because survival makes them both possible, and welfare doesn't. Can you think of a counter-argument to this? Well, one might be, if there's no species welfare, we can still have other welfare. So what do I mean by this? Up here we said if there's no species welfare, there's no relevant welfare. Whereas if we look down here, we can say, so even if we had to, for example, kill a species, we'd lose out on their survival. However, this might boost human welfare. For example, gladiators who killed off species for public amusement might boost human welfare, and we might say we should care more about human welfare than survival of species. You might say survival is also a necessary condition for causing negative species welfare, and therefore it's hard to see that survival is clearly more important than species welfare if it can cause both species welfare and negative species welfare, if it can cause both happiness and unhappiness. A second point would be that, well, biodiversity is good. Why? Well, people like variety, and variety supports ecosystems. If species survive, then there's more variety of species, which people like, and this supports ecosystems. We might ask, so what? Well, we should do what people like. Supporting ecosystems is good, and therefore species survival or survival of species matters a lot, because it does a couple of good things. Can you think of a counter-argument to this? Well, the one argues is that supporting ecosystems is good for welfare reasons. So if we take here and we say, well, supporting ecosystems is good, that's for welfare reasons, and that's to do with animal welfare. Supporting ecosystems is good because it's good for animals, or because it's good for humans, and humans are animals, you might argue. So it's good for welfare reasons, so the justification is also to do with welfare. You might also say, though this wouldn't be a direct counter-argument, it would be an interesting and useful point to make. Note that the point up here, this point, biodiversity is good, is not comparative. It says we should care about species survival, but it doesn't say we should care more about species survival than animal welfare. Therefore, it doesn't answer the question. I include this point to show that not all points are good, and you need to tailor them for the question to be answered. On the other side, we might consider that welfare is actually the thing that makes it worth surviving. You might ask, why survive if there's no welfare? Well, why? If species survival brings no welfare, for example, if one beetle species died out and there were only a couple of breeding pairs left, this wouldn't be very bad for the beetles because, let's say, the beetles in question didn't get much happiness because they don't have many pleasure receptors, say, or they don't have a sufficiently complicated nervous system to feel pleasure very strongly. They didn't get much welfare. And if we didn't know about the beetle species, we would feel, as humans, no loss of welfare. So species survival brings no welfare. Then there's no loss if there's an extinction. Who cares? So we care about species survival because of welfare. So what? Well, if there's no loss, then welfare is obviously the only thing that matters. Species survival only matters because of welfare. Can you think of a counter-argument to this? Well, it seems obviously circular. We assume that only welfare matters, so we assume that if species survival brings no welfare, then there's no loss if there's an extinction, and then it concludes that only welfare matters. So up here, assume only welfare matters, down here, conclude only welfare matters. That seems obviously circular. Let's have a look at what another assumption would have done. If we had ecocentrism and say that ecosystems matter in and of themselves, not for instrumental reasons, not because they help other animals, not because they help animals be happy, but because maybe they themselves have a right, or they themselves are living, which has been argued. If there's an extinction, so the survival of the species stops, and there's no welfare loss, like in the beetle example up there, then the only loss is to the ecosystem, we might say. We might say there is still a loss. Because we recognise there's still a loss, we can't conclude that welfare is the only important thing. So we see that the circular argument is circular and rests on the assumptions, because when we bring in a different assumption, the conclusion doesn't stand. As a second point on this side, we might say, talking of the word species is distracting. Using the word species is misleading. Why? Well, what does the word species mean? Well, it picks out a set of individual animals, that can produce fertile offspring when they mate with each other. That's what it means. Now, species are made up of individuals. So, if we say something is good for a species, then we're saying it's good only because it's good for the individuals in the species. It's meaningless to say, well, it's good for the species if it's bad for every single individual in the species. So maybe thinking on a species level and not on an individual level is just confused. You might say, so what? Well, survival is good for species. That I with two Fs is if and only if. So survival is good for species if and only if it's good for individuals of that species, taking into account those for whom it's bad as well. So still what matters is welfare. Can you think of a counter-argument? Well, structurally, we speak of human progress, even if not all humans are progressing. Even if the vast majority of humans, say, were sinking further into poverty, but humans were technologically developing, or morally developing, we might call that human progress still. So it's possible to speak of something being good for species or progressive for humans, even if it doesn't progress all humans, or even if it's not good for all species, or even most. Overall, I hope that's been helpful.